In the early days of Middle-earth, long before he became the Witch-King of Angmar, the man who would one day fall into shadow was a ruler of great renown. He was one of the 9 kings of men, a lord of considerable power, wealth, and wisdom. Though much of his early history is shrouded in mystery, it is known that he ruled over a prosperous kingdom, likely among the Númenórean-descended men of Middle-earth, whose line was blessed with long life and wisdom beyond that of other men. His kingdom was admired for its strength and influence, and he was seen as a wise and just ruler, beloved by his people. But his ambition was vast, and his desire to expand his influence and ensure his legacy would ultimately be his undoing. The man who would become the Witch King was not content to rule just a small portion of the world. Like many men of great power, he was haunted by the fear of mortality and the transient nature of life. Though his Númenórean blood gave him a longer life than most, even he could not escape the inevitability of death. This fear gnawed at him, especially as he watched the glory of Númenor fade and the kingdoms of men begin to falter in the face of internal strife and external threats. The king sought a means to protect his realm, to extend his life, and to ensure that his legacy would endure through the ages. It was at this vulnerable moment that he caught the attention of Sauron, the Dark Lord, who was then moving in secret across Middle-earth. Sauron, in his guise as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, was actively seeking out the greatest rulers of men, elves, and dwarves, knowing that their influence could be turned to his advantage. The Dark Lord, still posing as a benevolent figure of wisdom, offered gifts and promises that seemed too good to be true. For the kings of men, Sauron offered the ultimate prize, rings of power, forged in secret by his own hand. These rings were designed to grant great power and extend the lives of those who bore them. For a king with ambitions as grand as the man who would become the Witch King, the offer was irresistible. Sauron presented the ring not as a chain of enslavement, but as a tool of wisdom and might, capable of ensuring peace and prosperity for his kingdom for generations to come. The king, blinded by the allure of immortality and the promise of eternal rule, accepted the gift without question, eager to secure his place in history. However, the gift of the ring was not what it seemed. While it did indeed extend his life and grant him power beyond that of mortal men, it also carried a terrible curse. Unbeknownst to the king, the rings of power were all under the dominion of the One Ring, forged by Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom. By accepting the ring, the king had unwittingly bound himself to Sauron's will. The more he used the ring, the more his spirit came under the influence of the Dark Lord, and the harder it became for him to resist. At first, the king was unaware of the true nature of his new powers. His life seemed to flourish, as the ring allowed him to extend his rule and maintain his strength far beyond what would have been naturally possible. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, he began to change. His kingdom, once a place of light and prosperity, became overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. His subjects began to whisper of their ruler's strange new demeanor, how he seemed distant, cold, and more fixated on power than ever before. The ring, far from being a gift of wisdom, was slowly warping his mind, turning his thoughts to darker ambitions and binding him closer to Sauron's influence. As the years passed, the king's transformation into a wraith began to take hold. The once mortal man started to lose his physicality, his body slowly fading from the world of the living. The power of the ring, instead of sustaining him, was draining away his humanity, turning him into something less than a man, but more than a shadow. He became a specter, a being caught between life and death, trapped in the twilight world of the unseen, where only those under the sway of the rings could perceive him. The process of his transformation was slow and agonizing. His physical body withered, but his mind remained intact, fully aware of what was happening to him but powerless to stop it. The ring's power extended his life far beyond its natural span, but it was a twisted form of immortality, one devoid of joy, sensation, or warmth. The longer he bore the ring, the more he became a slave to it, until finally he was no longer a man at all, but a wraith fully under Sauron's control. The king, who had once ruled with dignity and strength, was now the Witch King, the chief of the Nazgul, the ring-wraiths who served the Dark Lord without question. The transformation was complete when he lost all memory of his former life. His kingdom fell into ruin, his people scattered, and the man who had once sought to preserve his legacy now existed only as a servant of evil, his identity erased, his soul utterly consumed. He had become the Witch King of Angmar, the leader of Sauron's dark forces, a being of shadow and malice who existed only to carry out the will of his master. The tragedy of his fall was not just in his physical transformation, but in the loss of everything that had once made him human. His name, his history, his ambitions, all wiped away, leaving only a shell of his former self. The Witch King's fate was sealed when Sauron appointed him as the Lord of Angmar, a kingdom in the north of Middle-earth that would serve as a stronghold for the Dark Lord's forces. From this base, the Witch King waged a relentless campaign against the northern kingdoms of men, particularly the Dunedain of Arnor. His military prowess, now enhanced by the dark magic of the ring, allowed him to crush his enemies with ruthless efficiency. But his victory came at a great cost. Though he succeeded in shattering the northern kingdoms, he had long since abandoned any remnants of the man he once was. His victories were hollow, driven by the insatiable need to serve Sauron, not by any desire of his own. The tragedy of the Witch King is one of the most profound in Middle-earth. Once a great and noble ruler, he fell victim to his own fear of death and desire for power, becoming nothing more than a tool for Sauron's evil. His transformation into the Witch King was not just the loss of his humanity, but the destruction of everything he had ever loved or fought for. He had sought to secure his place in history, but instead he became a shadow, forgotten and forsaken, remembered only as the greatest of the nine, the servant of Sauron, who would know neither peace nor rest until his final defeat. As the Witch King fully succumbed to the will of Sauron, he was tasked with one of his most pivotal roles in the Dark Lord's grand plan, the destruction of the northern kingdoms of Arnor. To achieve this, Sauron established him as the ruler of a new dark realm, Angmar. This kingdom, located in the icy and desolate northern reaches of Middle-earth, was a perfect breeding ground for the forces of evil. The Witch King, empowered by his dark master, quickly began to gather an army that would sow fear and destruction across the land. Angmar became a bastion of terror, a place where orcs, trolls, and other dark creatures thrived under the Witch King's command. The once great ruler, now fully transformed into a spectral being of immense power, operated without mercy or compassion. His sole purpose was to execute Sauron's designs, and the kingdom of Angmar became the epicenter of his campaign against the free peoples of the north. The Witch King's primary target was the kingdom of Arnor, once one of the two great Númenórean realms established in Middle-earth, along with Gondor in the south. Arnor, though powerful in its heyday, had been weakened over centuries due to internal strife and the division of its territory into smaller, competing realms, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudar. Sauron knew that Arnor's fragmentation made it vulnerable, and the Witch King was the weapon he would use to strike at this weakened foe. The Witch King's war against the northern kingdoms was a long and brutal affair, stretching over centuries. His tactics were not merely those of conventional warfare. He used fear as a weapon, and his very presence on the battlefield was enough to send armies into disarray. Those who opposed him often found themselves paralyzed with terror, for the Witch King was not just a skilled commander, but a being of dark sorcery whose mere approach filled the hearts of men with dread. The people of Arnor, already struggling with internal divisions, were ill-prepared to face such a foe. The Witch King's conquest began with the subjugation of Rudar, one of the three splinter kingdoms of Arnor. Rudar had long been a land of political instability and treachery, its rulers vying for power while neglecting the well-being of their people. The Witch King, always a master of manipulation, saw an opportunity in this fractured realm. Through cunning diplomacy and the use of his dark influence, he managed to place a puppet ruler on the throne of Rudor, effectively turning the kingdom into a vassal state of Angmar. With Rudor under his control, the Witch King now had a foothold from which to launch his attacks on the remaining northern realms. Next, he turned his attention to Cardolan, another of Arna's fractured kingdoms. The people of Cardolan, aware of the growing threat from Angmar, attempted to mount a defense, but they were no match for the forces of the Witch King. Cardolan's armies were systematically dismantled, its towns and villages laid to waste by the marauding forces of Angmar. The Witch King's mastery of fear and psychological warfare proved devastating. Entire garrisons would flee at the mere sight of his army on the horizon, and the land of Cardolan was soon reduced to a barren wasteland. The royal line of Cardolan was extinguished, and its people scattered, unable to resist the overwhelming darkness that had descended upon them. The final and greatest challenge to the Witch King's dominance in the north was the kingdom of Arthedain, the last remnant of the once great Arnor. Arthedain, ruled by the descendants of Isildur, had long stood against the encroaching darkness of Angmar. The kings of Arthedain, in particular, were vigilant against the Witch King, knowing that their realm was all that stood between Angmar and the complete destruction of the northern kingdoms. However, despite their best efforts, the forces of Arthedain were slowly worn down by the relentless assaults of the Witch King's armies. For years, the Witch King waged war on Arthedain, launching devastating raids and sieges against its fortresses and cities. The capital of Arthedain, Fornost, stood as the last bastion of resistance, but even it could not hold out indefinitely. The Witch King, relentless in his pursuit of Sauron's objectives, laid siege to Fornost with an overwhelming force. The city's walls, though strong, were no match for the dark sorcery and brute strength of the Witch King's army. Eventually, Fornost fell, and the last king of Arthedain, Arvedui, was forced to flee into the frozen north, where he met his tragic end, lost in the icy wastes. With the fall of Arthedain, Arna was effectively destroyed. The Witch King had succeeded in eradicating the Dunedain kingdom of the north, completing Sauron's long-held desire to see Arna wiped from the map. Yet, despite his victories, the Witch King's triumphs were tinged with a hollow emptiness. Though he had achieved much in Sauron's name, his own identity was completely subsumed by the darkness. He no longer sought personal glory or the fulfillment of his ambitions. He existed solely to serve his master's will. The destruction of Arna and the razing of Fornost earned the Witch King a terrifying reputation throughout Middle-earth. His cruelty and his willingness to employ dark sorcery set him apart from other servants of Sauron. Tales of his conquests spread far and wide, and the name of the Witch King became synonymous with despair and inevitable doom. Wherever he went, his enemies knew that defeat was certain, not just because of his military might, but because of the supernatural terror that accompanied him. Despite these victories, the Witch King's reign in the north was not destined to last forever. The surviving Dunedain, led by the descendants of Isildur, continued to resist, waging a long and bitter guerrilla war against the forces of Angmar. More importantly, the realm of Gondor, the sister kingdom to Arnor in the south, eventually intervened. Gondor, though distant, recognized the threat posed by the Witch King and his growing power in the north. The king of Gondor, Eärnur, led a great army north to confront the Witch King at Fornost, in what would become the climactic Battle of Fornost. In this final confrontation, the Witch King's forces were decisively defeated by the combined might of Gondor and the remaining Dunedain. Eärnur, though a valiant and skilled warrior, was no match for the Witch King in single combat. However, the Witch King, despite his overwhelming power, chose not to slay Eärnur, instead retreating from the battlefield. sensing that his time in the north had come to an end. The Witch King's retreat was not one of defeat, but rather a tactical withdrawal, as he was summoned back to Mordor by Sauron to prepare for the next phase of the Dark Lord's plans. Thus, the kingdom of Angmar fell, and with it, the Witch King's dominion over the north. His centuries-long campaign had devastated the region, and though he had failed to conquer all of Middle-earth, the damage he wrought left a lasting scar. The Witch King, though temporarily defeated, was far from destroyed. His true power lay not in the kingdoms he conquered, but in the enduring fear he spread, and his ultimate destiny was yet to be fulfilled. Now a master of darkness, the Witch King returned to Mordor to serve Sauron in the coming wars. Angmar's fall marked the end of his reign in the north, but his legacy of terror would live on, and his next chapter, the War of the Ring, would see him rise to even greater infamy. The Witch King's story, though marked by a long history of conquest and terror, reached its tragic and inevitable conclusion during the War of the Ring. His centuries of servitude to Sauron had brought him to the height of his power, but his end was destined to come as a result of the very forces of good he sought to destroy. By the time of the War of the Ring, the Witch King was no longer merely a servant of Sauron, but his most feared and powerful lieutenant. He had become the leader of the Nazgul, the Ring Wraiths, whose very presence brought terror and despair to those who opposed the Dark Lord. After his defeat in the north and the fall of Angmar, the Witch King had returned to Mordor, where he helped rebuild Sauron's strength in secret. Sauron had been vanquished after the Battle of the Last Alliance, but his spirit endured, and the Witch King had waited patiently for centuries as his master's power grew once more. By the time of the events chronicled in The Lord of the Rings, the Witch King was ready to carry out Sauron's final conquest. The destruction of Gondor, the last great kingdom of men in Middle-earth, and the capture of the One Ring, which would restore Sauron to his full power. The Witch King's first significant task during the War of the Ring was to lead the hunt for the One Ring. Sauron had learned that the ring had resurfaced, and it was in the hands of a hobbit from the Shire. The Witch King, along with the other Nazgul, was sent to track down the ring-bearer and retrieve the ring for Sauron. This hunt began with the Nazgul's relentless pursuit of Frodo Baggins and his companions as they traveled from the Shire to Rivendell. The Witch King, acting as the chief of the Nine, led the search with a terrifying precision, his mere presence driving fear into the hearts of Frodo and his companions. One of the pivotal moments of this chase came at Weathertop, where the Witch King confronted Frodo and the others. During this encounter, the Witch King struck Frodo with a Morgul blade, a cursed weapon that inflicted a wound not just of the body, but of the spirit. The blade's dark magic was intended to slowly turn Frodo into a wraith, just as the Nine Kings had once been turned by their rings. This act demonstrated the Witch King's mastery of dark sorcery and his ability to inflict suffering that transcended mere physical harm. Though Frodo was eventually healed in Rivendell, the wound left by the Witch King would haunt him for the rest of his life, a testament to the enduring power of the Nazgul. Despite this setback, the Witch King continued his campaign of terror. His next major task was the Siege of Gondor, where Sauron's armies marched to destroy the last great bastion of men in Middle-earth. The Witch King was appointed as the commander of Sauron's forces, a role that highlighted his significance in the Dark Lord's plans. He led a massive army of orcs, trolls, and other dark creatures to the gates of Minas Tirith, the capital of Gondor. The Siege of Gondor was one of the most pivotal battles of the War of the Ring, and the Witch King played a central role in orchestrating the assault. During the siege, the Witch King once again demonstrated the full extent of his powers. Riding his fell beast, a massive and terrifying creature of darkness, he led the charge against the city's defenses. His presence alone was enough to cause despair among the defenders of Gondor. The men of Gondor, though valiant, found themselves overwhelmed by fear as the Witch King approached. He broke through the city's outer defenses, and using his dark magic, shattered the great gates of Minas Tirith, a feat that no ordinary force of arms could accomplish. As the gates lay in ruins, the Witch King rode into the city, seemingly unstoppable. However, the Witch King's overconfidence would soon lead to his undoing. As he entered Minas Tirith, he encountered the unexpected resistance of Gandalf, the White Wizard, who stood firm against him. Though the Witch King was a being of immense power, Gandalf was able to hold him at bay, preventing him from advancing further into the city. This confrontation marked a turning point in the siege, as the forces of Gondor, though battered, began to rally. Even more importantly, the arrival of Rohan's army, led by King Theoden, provided a crucial reinforcement that disrupted the Witch King's plans to quickly overrun the city. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields, which took place outside the walls of Minas Tirith, was the culmination of the Witch King's campaign against Gondor. Here, the Witch King faced his ultimate fate. As the Rohirrim charged into battle, the Witch King took to the field on his fell beast, determined to slay King Theoden and break the spirit of the Rohirrim. His attack on Theoden was devastating. The Witch King's sheer power, both physical and magical, overwhelmed the king, and Theoden was struck down. It seemed for a moment that the Witch King would once again be victorious, and that the forces of darkness would triumph. But in this moment of apparent victory, the Witch King met his doom. A lone figure, Éowyn, the niece of King Theoden, stepped forward to challenge him. Disguised as a man to fight alongside her people, Éowyn stood defiant before the Witch King, despite the overwhelming terror that emanated from him. The Witch King, arrogant and assured of his invincibility, mocked her, believing no man could kill him. This was a fatal miscalculation, for Éowyn, a woman, was not bound by the prophecy that no living man could kill the Witch King. With the aid of Merry, a hobbit who struck a decisive blow from behind, Éowyn plunged her sword into the Witch King, piercing the shadowy form beneath his black armor. In that moment, the Witch King's physical form was destroyed, and his spirit was finally vanquished. The prophecy had come true, not by the hand of a man, but by the courage and resolve of a woman and a hobbit, two individuals whom the Witch King had dismissed as weak and insignificant. His death was a profound moment in the War of the Ring, as it marked the end of Sauron's most powerful servant and a turning point in the battle. The tragedy of the Witch King's demise lies not only in his defeat, but in the hollow existence he had endured for so many centuries. Once a great king of men, he had been reduced to a wraith, serving only the will of Sauron, devoid of any personal agency or ambition. His entire existence had been consumed by darkness, and his final defeat was not merely the loss of a battle, but the end of a soul that had been twisted beyond recognition. The man he once was had long been lost to history, and even in death, he was not remembered as a king or a ruler, but as the Witch King, a figure of fear and hatred. His fall also reflected the larger tragedy of the Rings of Power themselves. The 9 rings, which had once promised immortality and greatness, had instead brought ruin to the men who accepted them. The Witch King's story was the most extreme example of this ruin, as he had become the most powerful and feared of the Nazgûl, but at the cost of everything that had once made him human. His identity, his will, and his soul had all been consumed by Sauron, and in the end, he died not as the man he once was, but as a shadow in service to a greater darkness. The legacy of the Witch King endures in Middle-earth's history as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrupting power of evil. His downfall, while bringing hope to the free peoples of Middle-earth, is a reminder of the fragility of the human spirit when faced with temptation. The Witch King's death, though a victory for the forces of good, is ultimately a tragic conclusion to the life of a once great king who lost everything, his kingdom, his identity, and his very soul, to the darkness of Sauron.